barrel 75mm gun. In September of 1942, the new Tiger tank was rushed from the factory to join the beleaguered Panzer Division on the Eastern Front.
The Tiger I was originally developed from the concept of the breakthrough tank to make it so powerful and so well protected that no Allied tank would have a hope of destroying it.
This immense tank was fitted with the deadliest gun in the world, the infamous 88mm.
With the Panzers III and IV, we could start the firefight from only about 400 to 1,000 meters. Now with the 88mm gun and the Tiger I, we could destroy any enemy from about 1,800 to 2,000 meters. We could now go into battle with a great feeling of confidence and superiority. I remember at the end of 1942 on the Northern Front, I was in the Tiger and I was faced with 30 enemy tanks. I was able to knock out 15 of them without being hit. There was one big problem. At 60 tons, we were always in danger of sinking into the mud. And at the Northern Front, there was a lot of wet and muddy terrain. It was hardly possible to find a bridge that we could cross unless the engineers were to fortify them in advance.
Initially, the Tiger was unreliable and difficult to maintain. Even after these problems were resolved, German industry could never meet the Panzer Division's demand for the weapon. Only 1,350 Tigers were produced.
The fact was, it was never a battle one-on-one. It was always 1 against 5. 1 against 10. It was common for a Tiger to be facing 12 enemy tanks. I can remember when we were pulling back from Leningrad and there were 3 Tigers. We destroyed 52 Russian tanks, but they still had more tanks coming at us.
It was then that SS Lieutenant Michael Wittmann, who had already won the Knight's Cross in Russia, performed a feat which became a legend of the fighting style of the Waffen-SS. He was supervising some much-needed maintenance on his 5 Tiger tanks in a wood when he spotted a column of British vehicles travelling along the road running up the hill from Villers-Bocage. Realizing that they had halted, Wittmann jumped into his tank and charged down the column, firing as he went. Within a matter of a few minutes, he had knocked out 25 British vehicles. Wittmann charged on into the village, and only then was his Tiger disabled by a British Cromwell tank, firing at almost point-blank range.
Gotta do buzz switch, baby.
This amazing weapon could fire over 500 rounds per minute and was accurate to over 400 yards. But more importantly, it could be carried by just 1 soldier onto the battlefield.
That enough, or you want to do some more?
This assault rifle would change the face of combat over the next 60 years.
This particular weapon is the granddaddy of the AK and the M16 and all the assault rifles that are in service around the world. In my opinion, the most significant small arm fielded in the 20th century.
What was that? What the hell was that? It went by like we were standing still. Blue leader to group. Get off the air. Going by at 2 o'clock. What the hell is it?
It was the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It flies 150 miles an hour faster than our fastest fighters.
During World War II in 1944, Germany flew the world's first jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me 262. It was so fast that Allied pilots would say, "It's like a rocket." The Me 262 could reach speeds of 870 kilometers per hour, far ahead of any other aircraft of the time. Not only was it fast, but it was the first successful military use of two jet engines. But one bad decision by Hitler changed everything. He ordered it converted into a bomber, which prevented Germany from taking full advantage. If it had been used properly, history could have been changed.
Here's the mathematics of the main front. Only two countries have really big armies, Germany and Russia. Once the Germans maximize their territorial conquest, they've reduced Russian population to less than that of the United States, yet nevertheless the Russians mobilize twice the army that the United States does. And if you look at the mathematics of munitions, the Russians on their lonesome produce more munitions than did Germany. Once the United States gets in the war, we produce, I think it's like 100 billion and whatever dollars it was on munitions, and in that period the Germans produced less than 40 billion. Bad news for Germany on all of these numbers. The trick is getting the munitions to the men, whereas World War I, that wasn't feasible, but now these railway lines have been completed and it's pouring in.
There were very brilliant people in the German army. They asked OKW, or the German General Staff, how do you plan on knocking out Detroit? How do you plan on knocking out the Kaiser shipyards? How do you plan on knocking out the B-29 plants in the Middle East? How do you plan on knocking out U.S. Steel? How about Standard Oil? And Hitler said, what do you mean? He said, already we haven't even been at war. They have 6,000 four-engine bombers. They have this new B-17 they've had for 5 years. Our intelligence say they're making a B-24. The British have 4,000 Halifax and Hanley Pages, and we hear they're making a new Lancaster. We have not one four-engine bomber. Germany never made one four-engine deportable bomb. The Navy came to Hitler and said, well, it's very nice about submarine warfare, but there's only 10 submarines off the East Coast, and you went to war with 50 submarines. They'd finally lose over 1,000. They would produce 2,000, but they were not able to produce submarines in great number. But most importantly, Admiral Rader said, I think I've miscalculated. We have not built one aircraft carrier.
As America entered the Second World War in 1941, German and Japanese leaders believed that it would take years for the U.S. to produce enough war goods to pose a meaningful threat. This underestimation of U.S. industrial capacity ranks among the greatest blunders in military history. Within days of declaring war on the Axis powers, the U.S. launched an unprecedented mobilization for the war effort. The civilian economy virtually ground to a halt as resources were prioritized for military uses. In the year before the U.S. joined the war, American automakers manufactured about 3 million vehicles. During the entire war, only 139 additional cars were produced. Tens of millions of workers, including many women and political refugees from Europe and the Soviet Union, moved from agricultural jobs in rural areas to manufacturing plants in industrial centers to build ships, tanks, weapons, and warplanes. Production methods were constantly scrutinized to root out inefficiencies, and designs were regularly updated to adapt to ever-changing battlefield conditions. Though the US began the war with inferior equipment in many areas, including fighter aircraft, artillery, and battleships, it quickly caught up to, and often surpassed, the technological sophistication of its adversaries. The sheer scale of US manufacturing output between 1941 and 1945 is difficult to fathom. In 4 years, the US economy, already the world's largest, doubled in size. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all the military equipment produced by the Allies during the war: 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. At Willow Run, a Ford Motor Company factory in Michigan, a long-range bomber rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. A single American shipyard could produce an ocean-going merchant ship from scratch in a week. The US built nearly twice as many fighter aircraft and 5 times as many bombers as Germany. To win the war in the Pacific, the US produced 4 times as many battleships and 6 times as many destroyers as Japan. This crushing advantage in war production may have played an even greater role than tactical superiority or geopolitical skill in allowing the Allies to secure a victory.
Request care and treatment. Simply put down your weapons and surrender to the nearest German patrol. It is truly that simple. Death is a waste from which there can be no salvation. Do not permit you
bloodthirsty Stalin. There's no shame in surrender.
After sweeping through Poland in a month, through Norway in 2 months, and through the Low Countries and France in 6 weeks, continental Europe was in the confident grip of Nazi Germany. This enabled Hitler to concentrate on the USSR. In 1941, the offensive against the Soviet Union allowed Germany to capture Belarus, Ukraine, Baltic countries and other territories, and besiege Moscow and Leningrad. Nevertheless, Operation Barbarossa failed to defeat the Soviets in one single campaign, despite heavy losses taken by the Red Army. The main target of the German offensive in 1942 was Stalingrad and the oil reserves in the Caucasus. Hitler believed that destroying the industrial capacity of Stalingrad, capturing the main oil reserves of the Soviet Union, and taking control of the Volga, which had key importance for transportation within the country, would prove to be a decisive blow against the Soviets. Also, Stalingrad obviously carried a symbolic importance for both sides by virtue of being named after Stalin. This offensive was codenamed Fall Blau, Case Blue. The German army concentrated in eastern Ukraine was divided into 2. Army Group A, under command of Wilhelm List, with the 17th Army and the 1st Panzer Army, was ordered to march southwards towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. Army Group B, consisting of the 6th German Army and 4th Panzer Army, 2 Romanian armies, 1 Italian and 1 Hungarian army, was to secure control of the Volga and Stalingrad. It was commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. On the Soviet side, Marshal Yeremenko was appointed as commander of the Southeastern Front and was ordered to plan the defense of Stalingrad together with Commissar Khrushchev. The 62nd Army was created for the purpose of defending Stalingrad under the command of Lieutenant General Vasily Choykov. Operation Fall Blau was planned for late May 1942, but was delayed due to the Second Battle of Kharkov and the Siege of Sevastopol. Ultimately, the Germans succeeded, but lost time and were only able to start the operation in late June. By August 20th, German armies crossed the River Don and were at the doorstep of Stalingrad. Before the armies engaged in Stalingrad, the Soviet leadership ordered a shipment of grain and cattle to be removed from the city, but the civilian population of 400,000 was ordered to stay put. Initially, the Axis forces had 270,000 troops, 500 tanks, 600 aircraft, and 3,000 artillery pieces, against 190,000 troops, 400 tanks, 300 aircraft, and 2,200 artillery pieces commanded by the Soviets in Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad started with heavy bombing of the city by the most powerful air formation of the time, Luftflotte 4. The air raid by the Germans on August 23rd led to the deaths of hundreds of civilians, the destruction of all wooden construction in the city, and a firestorm. Early on, the Luftwaffe gained complete control over the air around Stalingrad, with the Soviets losing 201 aircraft in a mere 8 days. Despite the German advantage in the air and on the ground, the Soviets were putting up inspired resistance, with the female and underage population of Stalingrad building fortifications and trenches. This resistance did not stop German Army Group B reaching the north and south of Stalingrad by early September. A massive counter-offensive by the Soviet 24th and 66th Armies against the 14th Panzer Corps was defeated with help from the Luftwaffe. The Soviets lost 30 tanks in this failed offensive. A similar fate awaited the September 18th counter-offensive, with the Luftwaffe destroying more than 40 Soviet tanks. By September 12th, the Soviet forces fell back into the city, and a fierce battle for each building and house started. Stalin's Order 227 made unauthorized retreat be a cause for military tribunal. There was a not a step back attitude, and thousands of deserters were being executed. These were among the factors strengthening the Stalingrad defenders' will to resist even more. But historians argue that it would be wrong to explain the will to fight by coercion. A large number of volunteers, especially female volunteer fighters, snipers and nurses, is good evidence of that. Reinforcements were constantly arriving from the other side of the Volga. Strategic reserves from the Moscow area and aircraft from across the country were transferred to the Stalingrad area. Stalingrad's defenders were fighting for each lost position in an attempt to regain it as soon as possible. The Stalingrad railway station changing hands 14 times within 6 hours is a perfect example of this. The skirmishes within the city are very hard to describe, as they were extremely chaotic, slow and indecisive. The Germans first took control over the heights around the city, called Mamayev Kurgan and Lisaya Kura. Remarkably, 3 Soviet factories producing iron, tractors and T-34 tanks continued their production long into the German offensive. The fighting focused around these 3 objectives for months, until the Germans mostly took control of them in late October and stopped them from producing goods. The Soviets did their best to close in with the Germans in order to prevent the latter from using artillery. Another factor in the city battle was the use of snipers. The Germans had more experienced snipers, but the Soviets were learning on the go, and one of the most famous Soviet snipers, Vasily Zaitsev, participated in the battle, killing more than 200 enemies, including 10 snipers. Zaitsev managed to train more than 3 dozen snipers while the battle was raging on. This group constantly targeted German officers, which became a major issue for the commander of the German Sixth Army, Paulus. By the end of October 1942, the German army was in control of 90% of Stalingrad and reached the bank of the Volga. The total air superiority of the Germans was one of the decisive factors in this initial success. From the 16th to the 25th of September, the Luftwaffe carried out up to 10,000 flying missions, while the Soviet Air Force carried out slightly more than 11,000 between July 17th and November 19th. The onset of winter and intense resistance by the Soviets halted further German advances. One of the major weaknesses of the Germans was a very thin front line in Stalingrad, the flanks of which were protected by troops from German allies and satellites. These men were less motivated, lacked in arms, and were less prepared than the Germans. Calls for reinforcements were ignored. As a result, in some areas, stretches of 1 to 2 kilometers were protected by just 20 to 30 soldiers. There was so much focus on Stalingrad that the Germans neglected the consolidation of positions behind it. Requests by Paulus to fall back and consolidate positions behind the River Don were rejected. The symbolic importance of Stalingrad was too high for Hitler, and a withdrawal would be a serious blow to Nazi propaganda. By late autumn, Soviet generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky concentrated almost 800,000 men in the Stalingrad area in preparation for a counter-offensive. Operation Uranus started on the 19th of November 1942 with an attack by 3 armies under the command of General Vatutin. The operation aimed to break through the thin German lines on 2 sides and later merge these forces to achieve the encirclement of the German troops. The Soviet troops achieved this aim after 4 days on November 23rd. The 6th German Army, comprising of 265,000 personnel, was encircled by the Soviets. Despite the desperate situation of the 6th Army, Army Group A continued its operations in the Caucasus until December 19th. Soon it was in retreat and in no position to help the 6th Army. Army Group Don, comprised of 22 divisions, was formed under the command of Field Marshal Manstein to help out the 6th Army. Manstein convinced Hitler to not order the 6th Army to break out from encirclement, assuring him that Army Group Don would be able to save them if the Luftwaffe succeeded in supplying the 6th Army by air. Head of the Luftwaffe, Göring, believed that this would be possible. This tactic proved to be disastrous, since the Luftwaffe did not have the capacity to supply a huge army, including the core of the 4th Panzer Army, which needed constant fuel for operation. Also, the Soviet army targeted the air bases closest to Stalingrad, from which the supply flights were being made. This decreased supplies for the encircled 6th Army even further. The German offensive to save the 6th Army from encirclement came as close as 48 kilometers from the 6th Army, but eventually failed as well, also partly due to the inaction of the 6th Army. The situation was exacerbated by malnourishment among the German troops due to lack of supplies. Surrender was the only option for the 6th Army, but German High Command ordered them to resist as long as possible in an attempt to draw the attention of the Soviet armies to Stalingrad. Hitler's last grasp attempt to prevent the surrender of the 6th Army was made on the 30th of January 1943, when he promoted General Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal in the hope that Paulus would not want to go down as the first surrendered Field Marshal in German military history. But malnourishment, lack of ammunition, functional artillery and tanks led to the surrender of the 6th Army on February 2, 1943. Stalingrad was the first major defeat for Nazi Germany in Europe in the Second World War. It forced the Nazi leadership to call the German public to so-called total war, in which all the resources of the nation would be employed for ultimate military success. This would all prove to be in vain, as the Soviet forces were gaining momentum on the Eastern Front, and the British Army was defeating the Germans in North Africa and preparing for landings in Italy together with its allies. Thank you for watching our video on the Battle of Stalingrad. We are planning to release more videos on modern history and to cover the battles of the World Wars. These videos are made possible by the patrons over on Patreon and our YouTube sponsors. The links for both are in the description, along with the URL for our merchandise store. We are grateful for all your support. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.
Auf der Gürtelschnalle des deutschen Soldaten. Ja, und Gott
Tatsächlich ist mir noch gar nicht aufgefallen.
Denn es gibt keine schönere Aufgabe, als die abendländischen christlichen Werte gegen den östlichen Bolschewismus zu verteidigen. Und deswegen ist der deutsche Soldat im Gegensatz zum Bolschewik, auf dessen Gürtelschnalle kein Platz für Gott ist, nie allein, auch wenn er noch so tief in Feindesland steht.
Sachen nur nicht immer so mache. Ich wollte zur Wolga kommen. An einer bestimmten Stelle, an einer bestimmten Stadt. Zufälligerweise trägt sie den Namen von Stalin selber, aber denken Sie nur nicht, dass ich deswegen dort losmarschiert bin. Die könnte ja auch ganz anders heißen, sondern nur weil dort ein ganz wichtiger Punkt ist. Dort schneidet man nämlich 30 Millionen Tonnen Verkehr ab. Darunter fast 9 Millionen Tonnen Ölverkehr. Dort fließt der ganze Weizen zusammen aus diesen gewaltigen Gebieten der Ukraine, des Kuban-Gebietes, um nach dem Norden transportiert zu werden. Dort ist das Manganerz befördert worden. Dort war ein gigantischer Umschlagplatz. Den wollte ich nehmen. Und wissen Sie, wir sind bescheiden. Wir haben ihn nämlich. Es sind noch ein paar ganz kleine Plätzchen noch da. Nun sagen die anderen, warum kämpfen Sie da nicht? Weil ich kein zweites Verdun machen will, sondern weil ich das lieber mit ganz kleinen Stoßtrupps mache. Die Zeit spielt dabei keine Rolle. Es kommt kein Schiff mehr die Wolga hoch. Das ist das Entscheidende.
sollten aufpassen, was der Ivan macht.
Ein ganz kleiner Stoßtrupp.
Wie war das?
62. Vom Zählen war der Druck nicht mehr.
Dafür da ist Sammlung. Mit 400 Mann sind wir losgezogen.
Erzähl's nur jedem. Heb die Stimmung.
Wenigstens haben wir den Ofen vom Ivan. Scheiß Stotter nach dem Angriff.
Na, lieber stottern. Als einen kalten Arsch haben.
Ja.
Glückwunsch, Junge. Lebst noch. Ja, qualm dir eine.
Männer, das ist unsere Halle. Die müssen wir auf alle Fälle nehmen. Unser erstes Angriffsziel ist die russische MG-Stellung rechts vorn.
Unsere 818 haut der Schock in Russen aus dem Fenster. Nicht zu sehen, Herr Hauptmann?
Ist immer verdächtig. Hier, Herr Hauptmann. Wir sind jetzt bei Frieda 20. Feuer einstellen. Ich wiederhole, Feuer einstellen. Wo sind die 5 Sturmgeschütze? Hier ist noch keines zu sehen, wie immer. Zum Befehl, Herr Major.
Ist Ziel 2 alles frei, Herr Hauptmann?
Feuer nur auf meinen Befehl und äußerste Ruhe beim Vorgehen. Alles klar? Vorwärts, Männer! Mir nach! Feldmann! Ich kann doch nichts dafür.
Rast rein, jetzt weiß der Ivan, wo wir sind.
Es tut mir leid. Da könnt ihr nichts machen, er ist kaputt.
Er hat mir gesagt, sind besser als unsere. Versagen nie. Kopf hoch. Damit kann's schon.
And on the 5th day of the victorious offensive,
Advanced units of the southwestern and Stalingrad fronts met in the snow-covered steppes near the village of Savetsky. On November 23rd, exactly according to plan, the steel ring around the German fascist grouping between the Volga and the Don was closed. By December, the Nazi forces, surrounded on an area 30 by 40 kilometers, were separated from the remainder of their troops by 100 to 150 kilometers. To relieve their encircled grouping, the Germans now formed a new group of the Don Army under the command of Field Marshal Manstein. It advanced from the Kotelnikovo area in order to join the encircled forces. The enemy onslaught was repulsed by the 51st Army under General Trufanov and General Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army. The Soviet forces pressed ahead on the Donbass and Rostov sectors, threatening the enemy's entire southern grouping and forcing the Germans to make a hasty retreat from the North Caucasus. The fate of the enemy's surrounded troops was now decided.
Nothing is impossible. Get a smoke grenade. Throw out a smoke
smoke grenade! We've got to take out that gun! Fritz, the smoke grenade! Yeah! He's right, Herr Hauptmann. It's not possible. Feldman, now's your chance to make up for your mistake. Feldman, you want your wife and children to be proud of you, don't you? When you go back after the war?
I'll go, Herr Hauptmann. No, I want to go. I won't let you down, Herr Hauptmann.
I know, Feldman. We'll cover you. Here. Now go.
On the morning of the 2nd of February 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad came to an end following the surrender of the last pocket of German troops in the northern part of the city. At least that is what the history books tell us. It may be a surprise to some when I tell you that considerable numbers of German troops did not lay down their arms at this time. In fact, Soviet records indicate that an astounding 11,000 German soldiers continued to fight on long after Field Marshal Paulus and the 91,000 survivors of the German 6th Army were marched off to Soviet captivity, and would continue to resist for weeks, causing the Red Army to mount military operations through ruined Stalingrad to root out and, in its words, liquidate counter-revolutionary elements. This part of the Battle of Stalingrad has been completely ignored by historians, but over 11,000 German soldiers is not an insignificant number, and the omission is extraordinary. Stalingrad is rightly labelled as a major turning point in the history of World War II. What had seemed an assured German victory in summer 1942 would end up as a graveyard for the German army in the east. When the Germans invaded the USSR in June 1941, the campaign had been very successful until the Russian winter and resistance stopped the advance on Moscow. By spring 1942, the Germans resumed offensive operations. But instead of trying again to capture Moscow, Hitler ordered a shift in focus to the south and a two-pronged assault through the steppes of southern Russia. Army Group A struck south towards the Caucasus and the Soviet oil fields, whose product was vital to the German war plans, while Army Group B, which included the 6th Army, moved towards the Volga River and the industrial city of Stalingrad.
By summer of 1942, new posters were appearing in the streets of Moscow. Posters that greeted and welcomed their allies. Allies whose help was already arriving in Russian ports. Allies whose friendliness had sent drugs and food and warm clothing to help sustain them in their darkest hour. But in spite of all this, the staff of the Red Army knew that they still faced the most powerful enemy in history, and that enemy would attack again. But when this attack came, the whole German strength was to be concentrated on one objective: the Caucasus and oil. The Caucasus Mountains represent one of the toughest military obstacles in the world. Towering peaks rising to heights of as much as 18,000 feet, with only one practical highway traversing them. And Baku, the biggest oil field, is on the other side. To reach Baku, the only feasible military route was along the coast to the Caspian Sea. But the map shows what a dangerously extended supply line this would entail. To make the operation a success for the Germans, the first necessity was control of the northern hub of the rail lines of the area and a new base of operations. That hub was a Volga River port we have come to know well, Stalingrad, named for Russia's present leader. The pride of this generation of Russians, for it was their city, built in their time. With the capture of Stalingrad, the Nazis would have a base from which to launch a flanking attack on Moscow. With one master stroke, the Russian armies to the south would be cut off from help. And in the north, Russian factories, Russian farms, and Russian armies would be practically cut off from Caucasus oil, and also from American and British supplies, which were shipped to Russia through Iran and Iraq. German control of the entrance to the Volga and its two main ports, Astrakhan and Stalingrad, would be a crippling blow for Russia. For the Volga is the vital artery through which flowed the lifeblood of supplies.
The Germans' first mistake was to have the Luftwaffe pound the city to ruins, proving a difficult landscape for German motorized forces to penetrate and a defender's dream. German spearheads reached the city on the 23rd of August 1942, meeting disorganized, though fanatical resistance from the small garrison. The Soviets began to rush into Stalingrad as many units as they could, after realizing its importance to Hitler's plans. By early September, the Germans had partially encircled Stalingrad, and the Soviets could only supply and reinforce their units fighting inside the city across the Volga River under constant artillery and air attack. Street fighting was intense, with casualties high on both sides, and the battle seesawed across the ruins. For example, on one day alone, the railway station changed hands 14 times in just 6 hours of combat. Soviet resistance was incredibly stubborn, and the close proximity of German and Soviet forces to each other took away a lot of the Germans' advantage in supporting fire. Soviet static defenses in apartment blocks, ruined department stores, and of course the famous factories was incredible, coupled with very active snipers. Stalingrad became a mincing machine as both sides fed more and more units into the battle without either achieving complete victory. However, after 3 months of this appalling struggle, the Germans had managed to capture 90% of Stalingrad and reach the Volga River in the city. The fighting had cost the Sixth Army over 60,000 men, including 15,000 killed and missing. However, the Soviets realized that German manpower shortages had offered them an opportunity. To guard the flanks of Army Group B, the Germans employed Italian, Hungarian and Romanian forces to bolster the German defences. For example, a 120-mile sector north of Stalingrad was very thinly held by the Hungarian Second Army. These Axis troops lacked the weapons, vehicles, training and often the motivation of German forces. The southern flank was equally exposed, protected by the weak Romanian Fourth Army. On the 19th of November 1942, the Soviets struck, launching Operation Uranus, a huge pincer attack north and south of Stalingrad, which cut through the weaker Hungarian and Romanian armies and their overstretched German support, and by the 23rd of November had encircled 265,000 German, Romanian, Italian and Croat troops, including the entire Sixth Army. The Soviets began to compress the Stalingrad pocket, while the Germans launched a desperate relief operation to fight through to Stalingrad.
Огонь!
The commander of the Sixth Army, Colonel General Friedrich Paulus, requested permission to withdraw from the city and fight his way out west, but Hitler refused. Instead, the Germans attempted to keep the Sixth Army supplied by air until relieved. The Luftwaffe failed to bring in the requisite daily tonnage of supplies, and the Sixth Army, still defending vigorously, began to run out of ammunition, food and medical supplies. The relief operation failed, and Hitler left the Sixth Army to fight on for political reasons, doomed to destruction. Paulus was denied permission to surrender on several occasions, and told by Hitler to fight on to the last man and the last bullet. Winter greatly exacerbated the suffering. Once the airfields fell to Soviet troops, the only supplies coming in were intermittent drops by parachute. The Sixth Army starved but still fought stubbornly. Why? Because German soldiers feared Soviet captivity greatly, and they knew they could expect little quarter from the Soviets after the Germans had treated Soviet prisoners of war with contempt, killing hundreds of thousands and leaving millions to starve to death or die of disease and exposure during the first 2 years of the war in the East. The primal fear of Soviet retribution and a slow death in one of Stalin's dreaded gulags kept German soldiers fighting to the end and beyond. On the 22nd of January 1943, the Soviets made another request to Paulus to surrender. Paulus reported to Hitler that command was nearly impossible and his men were without food and ammunition. Hitler again refused to countenance surrender. On the 24th of January, Paulus radioed 18,000 wounded without the slightest aid of bandages and medicines. On the 26th of January, the German defense was split by Soviet attacks into a northern and southern pocket. The northern pocket lost telephone communications with Paulus, who was in a bunker in the city centre. By now, German sick and wounded was around 40,000 men. For the Nazis, Stalingrad had become a symbolic struggle and a warning that every German should do his utmost to support the war effort. On the 30th of January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's coming to power, the Führer promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. As no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, Hitler expected that Paulus would fight on to the last man and then shoot himself. But it was not to be. On the 31st of January, the Germans' southern pocket collapsed, and Paulus and his staff were captured in their headquarters in the basement of the GUM department store. Paulus claimed he had not surrendered, but that he had been taken by surprise, and so he refused to order the other German forces to surrender. the northern pocket continued to hold out. General Karl Strecker commanded the 6th Army's 11th Corps, which formed the northern pocket in Stalingrad. Strecker's corps was by late January 1943 largely isolated from the rest of the 6th Army. He was determined to hold out as long as possible and forbade any of his staff from committing suicide. He issued an order that any soldier seen breaking away from his unit or moving towards the Soviets was to be shot on sight. On the 1st of February 1943, after confirmation arrived that Paulus and all other combat commands had surrendered, Strecker gathered his staff and told them that the military situation was hopeless and that all the troops under his command had the freedom to act as their conscience saw fit. The 2nd of February, after further Soviet attacks, Strecker surrendered the 11th Corps. Paulus and 22 generals were separated from the other prisoners and held under tolerable conditions as VIPs. Due to the fact that most German prisoners were captured in a starving and often sick condition, Soviet treatment condemned most of them to death. They were forced marched through the winter conditions to labor camps where they died of malnutrition, wounds received in battle, diseases like typhus, the cold, and overwork. Out of 91,000 who were captured, only about 5,000 ever saw Germany again. It was this justified fear of Soviet captivity that kept over 11,000 German soldiers in the ruins of Stalingrad after General Strecker's surrender on the 2nd of February 1943. In small units or groups, or as individuals, huge numbers of German troops went to ground in the ruins, living in basements or the sewers, hiding by day, scavenging what supplies they could find at night, armed and dangerous fugitives with no command to report to anymore and no hope of rescue. But subsisting in the snow-laden wreck of a city was preferable for many to the labor camps, and these desperate men remained dangerous opponents. Soviet units under NKVD direction were ordered to root these last German soldiers out and either kill or capture them. It was a process that lasted well into March 1943. The 10th NKVD division had been present in the Stalingrad area since the previous summer, capturing Soviet deserters and suppressing banditry and criminality in the rear areas. The NKVD was assisted until the 1st of March by the veteran 252nd Rifle Division. Records are incomplete, but the NKVD reported that 2,418 Germans were liquidated by security forces after the surrender. For the first week after the final German surrender on the 2nd of February, Soviet troops searched the city for Germans, engaging in running gun battles with isolated pockets, and smoked them out of the sewer system. For example, on the 5th of February, Don Front headquarters reported that its 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade had located what it called 18 SS soldiers in a basement position. After they refused to surrender, they were all killed during an exchange of fire. As no significant SS units were engaged in the Battle of Stalingrad, these were German army troops. Constant mopping up operations resulted in many more prisoners being taken, aside from the 2,418 Germans killed after the final surrender. And some of these still fighting Germans did attempt to make it to German lines. In March 1943, a directive was sent to the district department of the NKVD at the Stalingrad region. It reported cases of German officers and soldiers hiding out and trying to cross the Soviet lines and reach German-held territory. Quote, "On the way, they are engaged in robberies and murders," unquote, read the report. Quote, "Some of the Germans penetrate the villages, where they acquire civilian or military clothing from the population and change clothes so that it is more convenient to hide," unquote. The Stalingrad region was ordered to be combed to find such men. There were even a few instances, as reported by the NKVD, of Germans having escaped from nearby POW camps. The NKVD reported that up to March 1943, 8,646 Germans had been captured. More work needs to be done in the Russian archives to fully tell the story of the Stalingrad holdouts, but what I have outlined here certainly gives an idea of the desperate plight of the remnants of the trapped Sixth Army. over 11,000 stories that were never told of the forgotten conclusion to the Battle of Stalingrad. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and also share. Also visit my new audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton, and you can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.
In the last months of 1942, the German forces were encircled at Stalingrad. At first, the Germans hoped to reverse the situation by relieving the pocket and maintaining it by air supply. However, as 1943 began, the Germans were forced to abandon their plans to relieve the city and were pushed back from its approaches. Despite that, they ordered their troops in Stalingrad to hold out as long as possible in order to tie up Soviet units and buy time. The advance of the Red Army created the possibility of the German troops in the Caucasus to be cut off. They ordered a full withdrawal from the region while their forces in the north kept the path of retreat open. The main effort of the Red Army was, however, directed against the Hungarian and Italian units on the northern flank. Their lightly equipped forces were unable to hold the line and were forced into a harsh winter retreat. Most of them lost their combat capabilities or were destroyed, leaving a large gap in the Axis lines. The German units in the north had also to retreat, but they were able to keep their battle worthiness intact. At the same time, the Germans managed to pull back part of their forces from the Caucasus. The remaining troops formed a bridgehead on the coast to retain the opportunity for a summer push towards the oil fields. During January, both sides had their full attention set on the southern sector. The lack of the German reserves allowed the Red Army to achieve two small but significant victories. They re-established a land connection to Leningrad, and in the central part of the front they captured the railway junction of Velikie Luki. For the Axis, the situation in the south continued to deteriorate. The German troops in Stalingrad surrendered, freeing up significant numbers of Soviet units. The Red Army forces moving west into the Ukraine were not very formidable, but the large gap in the Axis line left them little opposition. The Soviet command decided to exploit this opportunity and attempted to cut off almost all of the army group south. In response, the Germans used the forces retreating from the Caucasus to extend their front eastwards and pulled their main force west. The Red Army moved further west to bypass their line and encircle them, but this overextended their forces. The Germans counterattacked from two sides and disorganized their forward detachments. Having caught the Soviet southern flank off balance, the Germans now wanted to push in both from north and south at the same time, destroying the whole Soviet force. They began to muster their units for the northern attack. In the south, their troops continued onwards, retaking Kharkov. But in the north, they failed to concentrate a force sufficient for the attack, though they were able to stop the Red Army's advance. By this time, both the Soviets and the Germans had exhausted their forces and went on defensive. As the fighting in the south had drawn all German reinforcements, the Red Army prepared to launch a major offensive in the north and center. The Germans realized the danger and responded by abandoning their most vulnerable positions before the Soviets had finished deployment, and the attacks that took place failed to achieve their goals. Being confronted with a much stronger German line, the Red Army abandoned its offensive plans and the Eastern Front became quiet. With the end of the winter campaign, the Axis had lost the capabilities necessary to knock the Soviet Union out of the war by capturing the areas vital for its war effort. Now they planned to win through attrition by holding on to the occupied areas and inflicting vast casualties to the attacking Red Army. In this way, they could drain the areas remaining under the Soviet control, dry up resources, and create a stalemate. The Red Army, on the other hand, set out to take back the economically vital western lands of the Soviet Union, which would give it a strategic advantage. However, this time they would play it safe. Their previous offensives had been threatened by the German armored counterattacks, and this time they decided to receive them on prepared defenses. At the same time with building up the fortifications, the Red Army formed a massive offensive force. As part of their defense strategy, the Germans planned a number of limited offensives to encircle Soviet forces and shorten their defensive line. The most promising of these was the encirclement of the Soviet units in the Kursk salient. It took 3 months for the German build-up to match the gradually improved Soviet defenses, and in the beginning of July they launched their attack. The Germans made some headway, but were ultimately stopped dead in the depth of the Soviet defenses. Having for the time tied up the strongest German armored units, the Red Army now released its forces for the offensive. The attacks were to be carried out in consecutive stages along several sectors of the front. First, the Red Army struck into the rear of the German troops north of Kursk. Being unable to contain the attack and wishing to avoid the danger of encirclement, the Germans began the process of evacuating the salient. At the same time, the Red Army launched an attack in the south. The Germans redeployed their forces and contained it. By this time, the Soviet units south of Kursk had finished reorganization and pushed towards Kharkov. The Germans redeployed their forces to the sector but failed to hold the city, though succeeded in temporarily containing the Soviet advance. The situation in the north was more under the German control. The Red Army failed to break through the German defenses near Smolensk. At the same time, the Germans had finished their withdrawal to the new line, strengthening their positions further. By this time, the Germans had been able to maintain the balance and check the Red Army's attacks. However, the renewal of the Soviet offensive near the sea broke the German line and forced them into a large-scale retreat. Even more, the concurrent offensive against the lightly fortified German positions on the former western edge of the Kursk salient resulted in a breakthrough the Germans weren't able to contain. They now realized that they lacked the troops necessary to contain the Soviets in their present line and ordered a retreat to a much better defendable Panther-Wotan position that was centered around the Dnieper River and its tributaries. At the same time, the Soviet breakthrough near Smolensk hastened the retreat of Army Group Center. With the German forces taking a stronger defensive position, the Red Army had to concentrate its main effort on a shorter section of the front. They decided to make regaining western Ukraine the main priority. First, however, we'll take a look at the central part of the front, where the Red Army had outrun the Germans to the Dnieper and had established a breachhead on the junctions of the Army Group Center and South. They planned to trap the whole Army Group Center by combined strikes from the breachhead and from a breakthrough in the north, while the other forces would pin the Germans in place. In October, while part of the Red Army was still recovering from the pursuit, battles were fought in order to secure the breachhead. Meanwhile, the other forces began creating a breach in the northern part of the front. With their main focus being in the south, the Red Army had established several breachheads over the Dnieper in Ukraine. After they had got their heavy equipment over the river, they attempted local breakouts, first of which took place in the south. The Germans were able to contain it. Then the Soviets broke through the German land front, severing their connection with the Crimea. They proceeded with another breakout attempt near Kiev, but the Germans redeployed their troops and pushed it back towards the river. Having not fully succeeded in the breakouts, the Red Army adopted a more systematic approach, slowly but surely expanding its breachheads and massing troops for a larger breakout. In the center, the Red Army was now better prepared, which allowed it to increase the pressure. It resulted in a breakthrough in the north. The Germans held on to the flanks in the hopes of conducting a counterattack and cutting the Soviet forces off. Then the Soviets launched their main attack from the southern breachhead. It broke through the lines and gained limited success, though it failed to achieve its objective. The Germans were able to prevent a deeper breakthrough by abandoning territory and pulling back their front line. As 1943 ended, the Red Army was ready for the winter offensive, which would encompass the whole Soviet-German front. In Ukraine, the Germans had concentrated their defenses in the Great Bend of the Dnieper. This allowed the Red Army to catch them off balance by mounting a breakout from the Kiev breachhead. The Germans managed to contain their advance only with great difficulties. They wanted to keep their last position near the Dnieper River as a staging area for a possible counterattack and did not evacuate it despite the evident threat. The Red Army exploited this by cutting the salient off with a two-pronged attack. The Germans launched a rescue attempt and were able to retrieve part of the encircled forces, but without their heavy equipment. With the German attention directed towards the pocket, the Soviet forces launched attacks on the flanks, threatening to sever the connection between the army groups south and center. Meanwhile, Soviet troops were continuing with their attempt to encircle Army Group Center itself. In the north, the Germans realized they lacked the force to cut off the Red Army's breakthrough and abandoned the exposed salients. The Red Army now attempted to encircle the town of Vitebsk, but it was not met with success. Most of the Red Army's offensive assets were deployed in the south, and as a result, the goals of the Soviet forces in the center proved to be beyond the means to achieve them. The offensives took limited territory at the price of large casualties and were eventually abandoned. During the summer, the Soviet pressure on the Army Group North had not been as strong as against the other army groups, and the Germans had dispatched a lot of its strength to other fronts. Despite its greatly reduced strength, the army group had not withdrawn to the shorter line and still held its forward positions. The Red Army attempted to encircle part of the German forces during the winter offensive. The Germans evaded the encirclement and then attempted to resist on the new positions, but they lacked the strength to do so, and it was decided to withdraw to the Panther Line. Both armies settled on the new line, and during the remaining part of the winter, the Red Army undertook only some limited attacks in order to probe the German defenses. The Red Army was planning to achieve its main success in the south. During the preceding half-year, the Soviet forces were slowly but steadily consolidating their positions on the west bank of the Dnieper, and by the beginning of March, this process was complete. The German Army Group South was by then pushed into the open plains and did not retreat behind any other natural obstacle, leaving it vulnerable. The Soviets wanted to pin the whole army group to the Carpathian Mountains or the Black Sea and destroy it. The Axis were unable to resist the Soviet tank armies, and the whole front fell back. Near the Black Sea they began pulling back their forces, but in the west the Red Army encircled several German corps. The Soviets made the mistake by expecting the Germans to retreat southwards, which allowed them to extract most of the trapped force back to their front lines. Then the Red Army captured the Crimea as the last operation of the winter campaign. The Soviet Union had taken back its most economically valuable lands and gained the resources it needed to defeat Germany completely. However, with the front being still more close to Moscow than Berlin, the question was, how long shall it take? The Germans, meanwhile, had other problems to deal with. The Western Allies had landed in Italy and were preparing to do the same in France. The race to Berlin was on.